Welcome back. In this video we're going to create a node group that's going to allow us to remove any seams or tiling artifacts from just about any image that you want to use on your models. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my default cube and I'm going to add in a plane. The next thing I want to do is just go to the shading workspace and turn on cycles. And now we'll be able to see our result in the viewport. We're going to add a new material to that. Make a little bit of space by closing that panel with N, and let's add in an image. Now at this point you might want to go off and find your own image to use, or you can use something on your system, do a Google search, even go out and take a photo. So I'm going to hit open. My window has opened up on a different screen. I'm going to use this image, grass.jpg. And this is just a photograph I've taken, so it's going to be available in the resources for you and you can use it however you like. Let's have a look at the result, and you can see that what we have here is just a photograph of some grass, nothing fancy. But if we go to our mapping node, texture coordinate and mapping, using Control T, and we increase the scale, you can see that we're getting that checker texture here. This is not set up to tile. And even if it was, there's still a chance we'd get some of these same tiling artifacts. So we'll take that scale back to 1. And now what we want to do is we want to figure out a way to randomly apply this to the plane in different patches that we can then move around, scale, rotate, and get a much better result. So I'm going to take away this mapping node just now. I'm going to plug in our UVs. And just to tidy up the scene a little bit, I'm going to use Control H to hide all the other outputs from this texture coordinate node. Next, I'm going to grab a texture, Voronoi texture, and we're just going to have a look through the color output of this texture. So you can see here, we have a whole bunch of individual little cells, and we also have an output for position. If we look at that, what you can see is we have a bunch of different values. Now this gives us a vector output and we already have a UV output. So similar to what we did a couple of videos ago when we compared the bevel output of a node with its regular normals to get a result, we're actually going to subtract these vector positions from this texture UV. So let's grab a converter, vector math node. We'll plug this in here and we'll change this to subtract and we'll plug in this position. Now, if we look at our result here, what you can see is now we have all these individual texture coordinates placed right in the middle of each of these cells. Now, if we zoom in on one of these in particular, what you can probably just about see on the video is a faint line across here and down here. So these are where our axes finish. This is essentially 0, 0 on the X and Y axes. So if we actually use this as our vector for our grass, what we'd see, and it might not be super obvious at first, we have a seam running right along the middle of all our UV spaces. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to fix that, because we definitely don't want a seam right in the middle of each of these cells. It would be much better if this seam started way down here and we essentially had a 0 to 1 kind of size on each of these individual cells. So let's grab a mapping node. We're going to take this and we're going to plug this in right before our image. What we want to do is we want to change this location so this axis is more like down here. For this individual cell, we want the axis to be around about here. For this one, we would want it to be around about here. So we're going to take it back to the left and down a little bit. Now, as far as mapping nodes go, the way we do that is we take these values and we just increase these a little bit, and you can see that cross is heading down to the left. So if we take that to, let's see, about 0.5, I think now we should have decent texture coordinates for each of those. And if we look through our grass node, okay, so now you can see that although it does look like we have some obvious tiling in there, we don't have as many seams, or at least we shouldn't have as many seams. Now the next step that we need to do is we need to do some randomization to these. So at the moment, let's actually plug in this UV to our vector. That's one thing that I forgot to do. And just so that we can work on everything together, let's take this scale down to 1. And you can see we start to get some issues. Let's add in a redirect. And let's add in a vector math node. And let's just set up a scale that we can use for everything at once. So now we have a scale that we can use to increase that. Let's take that to about 3. And we'll use this. Now we have quite a few seams that we can work on and play around with. So if we look at our texture coordinate nodes now, you can see again we still have that X shape here. We go to our mapping node, we've moved it down, but you can still see that in some of these cells we still have that gradient coming to an end, and that's going to cause a little seam happening just in there. So anytime you see these horizontal seams, that's what's happening in those cases. But what we can do is we can grab this scale and we can just decrease this scale and hopefully just push all those seams off the edge of each of those individual cells. So now what we have is we have all these cells where we shouldn't have any evidence of those crosses. Now if you look just on this one, we might just see a seam there. It's a little bit hard to see, but I think there might just be a little seam hiding in there. But hopefully that's not going to be very obvious. And the next step that we're going to do should completely remove that seam. So at the moment we're working with this Voronoi texture, and each of these cells has really flat, straight edges. Now we want to take those edges and we want to give them a little bit of a wobble that we can use to break up any of those hard edges. So we've seen this before. We are going to use a mixed color node. We're going to set it to linear light. We're going to grab a noise texture. We're going to plug the color into slot 2. We are going to plug the vector into here so we can control all the scales through this one scale node. We'll take this scale and we're going to increase it a little bit, maybe up to about 10 or so. I'm going to take this factor way down. And now you can see that we can slightly warble those edges. As you already know, I don't like using factors and values that are so low. So we are going to grab a converter math node. We're going to set this to divide, and we're going to divide by 100. We're going to plug this value in over here to our factor. So now we have a value that we can work with a bit easier. We can use values in between about probably 0 and 10, maybe anything higher would be too much. We'll keep with a value of about 4 for the moment. And if we go back to our image and we look at these edges now, you can see that we have a little bit of a breakup there, but it's still kind of obvious that we have a seam and it doesn't look perfect quite yet. So the next step we want to do is we want to essentially take this same setup and duplicate it at a much higher scale. So let's take that linear light node, let's duplicate it. Let's take this noise texture node, let's use Control Shift D when we duplicate it, so we keep the vector plugged in. We'll take this color and we'll plug this into slot B. We'll duplicate this divide and we'll plug this into the factor. And now if we look on this edge, and we take this scale, and we take this scale to something like 500, you can see that we are really breaking that up. We're also going to take the detail all the way up, and we're going to take the distortion up to 50. So this really takes this map, and it almost works like a blur. And you can see we've pretty much hidden that edge completely. These two textures blend together quite nicely, and it's almost impossible to see that edge even at a distance. Now, when we look at it from this far out, you can see that we have some kind of dark areas heading into light areas, and you can still see the overall shape of these cells. So there's maybe still some adjustment we can do. We can maybe increase some of these values a little bit, increase some of this a little bit as well. That starts to hide things. We could also go back over to our scale here, increase this or decrease this a little bit more to try and remove some of that. So we have a few different options to start hiding these seams. And one thing that I think will help quite a bit is giving each of these a random rotation. So at the moment we have rotation within this mapping node, which is really useful because we can just use this without creating any more new mapping systems. We'll grab a combine XYZ node, which we'll plug directly into rotation. Now, the reason that we're going to do this is because we don't want to change the X and Y rotation, because that's going to stretch our texture. We only want to rotate in the Z axis. And since we want to give this a random rotation, we need to figure out a way to get a random value for each of these cells. Now, luckily, we already have that because we have this color output that has all these individual colors. So what we can do is we can just grab a math node. You're going to take this to multiply. You're going to multiply by 180. So we'll take this color, plug it into our value, plug this into Z. We'll have a look at our result. And now we have some random rotation. Now, we could also take this value, we could increase it or decrease it even more. It's really up to you. 180 just means that if we have a value of 1, we get something flipping right over. But there's no reason to say that we can't use a value of 360 here for even more random rotation. It's entirely up to you. You could even plug this into your node group, so you have control over how much rotation there is. In case maybe you don't want any rotation, you can just have this multiply set to 0 and remove all the rotation. But for the moment, I'll keep 360 in there. The next thing I want to do, just to increase the randomness of this, is to change to 4D in the Voronoi texture. The reason I want to do that is because now I have access to this W value. This W value essentially lets me move all these cells around, so I can tweak them to get just the right setting. So now that's looking a lot better. Now, that's the final step essentially in this group. If we take this scale and we take it to something like 50, you can start to see that even at that massive scale, what we're getting is just a kind of almost random color values here. We're not getting any real tiling artifacts. If we take this down to a much more suitable scale, something like 10, you can see that if we have that on a large grassy area, it does not look as if it's tiling. We don't see the same things over and over again the same way we do in most tileable textures. Okay, so it's challenge time. So your challenge on this one is to choose, connect, and name all the suitable inputs for your node group, and name your node group. Don't forget to choose suitable minimum and maximum and default values as well. Test out your node group with a few different images. See how far you can take it, see which images work well and which ones don't, and see if you can find any obvious limitations. Finally, add the node to your asset browser for future use. So pause the video, have a go at that, and join me in a moment and I'll show you how I would do that. Okay, so I hope you got on okay with that challenge there. I'm going to finish up my node group. I'm just going to go to full screen using Control Spacebar, and let me just set up this node group really quickly. So one thing that we don't need here is we don't need our image. This is all going to go before an image, so I don't actually need this within the node group. The UVs, well, the UVs generally you are going to use within the node group. I'm going to leave that out as well, just in case we ever need to plug in anything else. So we're going to take all of these nodes, hit Ctrl G, and turn this into a node group. So first of all, let's go with the most obvious ones. We need our scale. We'll go with this seed setting as well. Next, we'll go with our edge breakup factor. And we'll go with our edge blur factor. And we can also use this roughness. This roughness is going to tone down the amount of blur on that breakup as well. Now, as far as all the other nodes go, I don't think there's much else we need to do. We need the random rotation. So we'll grab that. Now, the final thing I want to do is I want to have a control for this scale. So at the moment we have this value of 0.54 in each of these slots. Let's just grab a converter math node. Let's do a multiply. Let's set this to 0.54. We'll set this second value to 1, and we'll plug this value into the scale. Now that's going to change all three of those values, and that's the way translating from a value to a vector works. It's going to replace all three of those values, and we'll take this across here, and we'll plug this in here. Now we have to name these nodes, and this is where things get a little bit tricky. So we have our vector, that's fine. We have our scale, that's fine. W, we're going to change to seed. Now, the values here don't matter at all. The minimum and maximum don't matter, so we can leave those. this first value is going to be our edge breakup. We are going to set our default here at maybe around about 5, minimum at 0, or maximum, well, let's try something like 50. I doubt we'll ever have to go up that high. Now we're going to do our edge blur. Again, default, we'll keep that where it is, 0. And the maximum, again, take it to about 50. But again, I don't think we're ever going to have to use that much. Now, this roughness is going to be our width. So the way this is going to work is the higher we have the roughness, the thinner our blur is going to be. So we'll just call this blur adjust. The chances are we're not going to use this setting. At the moment, I'm going to keep the default value of 0. And the minimum and maximum values, 0 and 1, should be just fine. The last thing we have here, or the second last thing we have, is our rotation. So this is going to be our random rotation. Our default is going to be 360. Our minimum is going to be 0 because we might want no rotation. And our maximum is going to be 360. And finally, we have one last value. And this is going to be our... It's kind of hard to come up with a name for this. I'm going to call it texture zoom. Because essentially what it does is it scales the texture in the middle of each of those cells and kind of zooms in so you don't see the edges of those textures. So I think that's actually an okay setting. We're going to give it a minimum 0 and a maximum here of 1. I think that should work fine. Obviously, if we have any issues, we can just go back and fix that. I'm going to call this tile anything. We'll duplicate that name. We'll go to our node. We'll change the name and the label of that. And let's have a look at our result. Go back to previous so we can see. So we want to look at our color. Okay, so we have our scale set to 10. Let's take that to 5. Let's change your seed. Seed's working fine. Edge breakup, let's take that all the way down. Let's take the edge blur all the way down as well. Now we should have a sharp edge. Let's take that edge breakup up a little bit. Add in some of that blur. Excellent. We have our blur adjust. So if we take that down, it widens the blur a little bit, makes it a bit more smoother. Take that up, it takes that blur out. Now you can see either of those settings work fine. These textures seem to blend together quite nicely. See, we have our random rotation. That's quite a big value, so no random rotation. And maximum random rotation, that's fine. And we have our texture zoom. So if we take this value down, we zoom into our texture. Now that works a little bit kind of counterintuitively. I like it so that if we have this up at 1, we are zooming into our texture. I think I can live with the fact that works. And there we go, we have a nice tileable texture that we can use across our model. Final thing that we need to do is let's just add this to our asset browser. Blender file, node groups, right click and mark as an asset. And then remember, we have to save this within our asset browser folder. Okay, and we'll call this tile anything. And now we have access to that node in any other file that we want. Now just to test that, let's make sure it works on another image. I'll just open up another image I took, I should say. And this was just some stones. So the original image, if we just cut this off, was this. You can see we have a dark area down here, dark area here, lots of green in this area. When we plug that in, you get this nice tileable texture that works quite nicely. I don't even have to really adjust any of the settings here. It actually looks good already. And there's the seam. Even looking at it close up, it's really hard to see that seam. Maybe increase that break up a little bit. And yeah, that seam just completely vanishes, even on something with quite a lot of contrast, quite a lot of obvious shapes, like these stones. That seam just completely disappears. Do we have one here? I actually thought we had a seam there, and the seam is in fact right next to it over here. It just completely vanishes. So that is really the power of this node. Whether it's stones, grass, dirt, it's going to work quite nicely. The only thing it won't really work on is it won't work on things like tiles won't work on bricks because there's just too much of a uniform pattern to those to use this kind of tiling system. So that's the only downside to it. It won't work on things like block work, brickwork, tiles, wood. It probably won't work on most woods as well because you have grains running the same direction and things like that. But for something like this, it works really nicely. And that takes us to the end of the creating generators section. I hope you enjoyed this section and you learned a lot. In the next section, we're going to move on to some more advanced shaders where we're going to deep dive into more vectors, more UV setups and vector math, as well as using a few of the generators that we've created in this section to make things a lot easier when we're creating these really large complex node trees. I'll see you then.